Let's start at the very beginning. A very good place.
Okay, let's talk about stories. The beginning of stories. All stories have a beginning. Stories are made up of a beginning, a middle, and an end. The storyteller starts us somewhere. Once upon a time, it was a dark and stormy night. You will never believe what happened to me today. Where a story begins tells you what kind of story we are in and what sort of story to expect. Now, we humans, we are very smart and we are very, very good at categories. The beginning of the story tells us what category our story belongs in and how we are supposed to understand the information being told to us. When a story starts, for example, with Once Upon a Time, we know that the story we are about to hear isn't a CBC News report about a current event. It isn't a recipe or the directions to get to your grandparents' house. It is a fairy tale, and therefore has a certain way of unfolding. Beginnings of stories tell us about the world and the reality of the story, where we are and what to expect. It is the coding, the filing system, the markings that help us to understand what kind of story it is. Then we have the middle of the story. The middle of the story is where something happens. According to Aristotle, this starts with conflict, but more on that later. The middle of the story is usually the biggest part of the story, a series of happenings that leads to the thing the storyteller thinks is the most important idea. That usually goes at the end of the middle section. So usually, and I know that you can name at least one story that doesn't do this, but usually the middle of the story starts with conflict and ends with the most important idea. The end of the story is often the hardest part to tell. One of the gifts of story is that a whole lot of information can be packed into a very simple or short story. The ending is what finishes the frame of the story and leaves the audience, the readers, the listeners, in a different place than where they were at the beginning of the story. Not a physical place necessarily, but having learned something, having gone somewhere, having understood something in a way that they hadn't understood in this way before. Like beginnings, the end of the story helps us understand how we are expected to think about the story and what we are supposed to do with the information. It tells us how to leave the story and what the storyteller wants us to do with the information we have received. Now, this beginning, middle, and end thing, it isn't about time. Some stories are told backwards. Some stories are told entirely out of order. Some stories end right where they left off. Stories can be told in many, many different and wonderful ways. This beginning, middle, and end structure, it isn't about time, it's about frame. How is the story told to us? Why is it told to us this way? What are we supposed to do with this information?